Okay, it's rolling. We take political education seriously in DSA, and we're especially proud of our efforts along these lines in North Brooklyn. We know that activism and organizing are crucial, but we also have to hone our understanding of history and theory, socialist and otherwise, our sense of strategy, and our talents for argument if we want to succeed at transforming this depraved society. We look to political education to help us break down the distinction between thinkers and doers, a mark of the class society we live in, and also give the organization a real social and intellectual internal life. Today's topic makes the importance of the relationship between thought and activism very clear. The neoliberals have been very masterful at both. There's a tendency on the left to think people on the right are dolts. That's true if you're talking about Matt Gaetz or Sean Hannity, but it's most certainly not true of what's been dubbed the neoliberal thought collective. From the first, if we want to date the modern neoliberal movement back to the first meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society in 1947, although Quinn takes it back a little further than that, they had a blueprint for the world they wanted to see and were admirably skilled at making it happen. Of course, they had money on their side, and we have money against our side, but sometimes I feel like we could learn a lot from them, despite that imbalance of resources. Our speaker tonight, Quinn Slobodian, is a historian who teaches at Wellesley College. His book, Globalists, The End of Empire and the Birth of Neoliberalism, was published by Harvard University Press in 2018. It's an intellectual history of the movement that has done a lot to transform the world over the last 5 or so decades. The word is often used as a slur by people who don't really know what it means, but as we'll hear, it does have a precise meaning beyond being used as pejorative to describe the nasty form of capitalism we've been living under. And for a movement or a body of thought that's been pronounced as dead almost as many times as Marxism, it's still showing stubborn signs of life. Since Globalists, Quinn has written on, among other things, the anti-mask movement in Germany, a strange coalition that unites, among others, neo-Nazis and celebrity vegan chefs. It's useful to learn that we in the US don't have a monopoly on political wackiness. So I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, who brings to a close this spring's night school, Quinn Slobodian.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much. I'm really happy to be here on this lovely Atlantic seaboard early summer evening to talk about a topic that I find myself talking about a lot, which is neoliberalism. I have some things to say about it, but I would preferably just have this as a more of a open conversation and back and forth with some of the distinguished people who are here. So I will probably talk for maybe 15 minutes and then would just be happy to just have a kind of ask me anything, let's just hash it out kind of a engagement on the topic. I circulated a couple of writings ahead of this, Stephanie Mudge's short piece, as well as Raywin Connell and Naur Dados's piece. And I circulated those partially because I think they kind of run against the way that I approach the topic. So I wanted to make sure that I wasn't coming in sort of doctrinally saying, you know, here is the way that one can understand neoliberalism, and you either do it my way or else you're, you know, breaking the rules, the linguistic rules. That's definitely not my intention in general, and not my intention here this evening. I'd like to sort of give a bit of a panorama of the way I think that people have used the category for those people that find themselves rightfully bewildered by its many and sometimes contradictory uses. And then explain a little bit why I made the choices that I've made about using the category in my scholarly and kind of more public facing work. So Stephanie Mudge introduces about 3 ways to talk about the category of neoliberalism. And I realized sort of rereading her piece that she's not the first person to have done this and not the last person. And in some ways, I think there's a kind of a rough agreement around people from kind of Daniel Rogers to her and others to say that there's kind of 3 ways people use neoliberalism. Now, the first way they use it is as a kind of a means of periodization, I think. So to describe a kind of era in global history from around, you know, late 1970s, early 1980s, up to the present question mark, right? And then this then becomes the kind of the prompt to discussion. Is neoliberalism dead? Is it on the ropes? Is it reviving, et cetera? So this frame the sort of the life and death of neoliberalism, the kind of Bildungsroman of neoliberalism as a global capitalist mode, is sort of fits best in the approach that sees it as a mode of periodization. The second way I would say that historians approach, not just historians, really more political scientists here and sociologists approach the category of neoliberalism, is as a kind of package of policy proposals. So it's a kind of laundry list of things, right? The most well-known example here is the Washington Consensus. So in this sense, it's actually a very sort of concrete way of approaching the topic, because you can kind of go down this list and say, well, is this country doing things 1 through 10? If so, then they are practicing neoliberalism, right? Are they engaged in privatization? Are they engaged in forms of austerity, whatever, central bank independence, down the list? Then this gives you a kind of a relative gauge on neoliberalism. And a way that I've actually seen this done well recently, I think, in a slightly different register is to use the way that the way that nations are ranked on the economic freedom of the world indexes, which were created by the Cato Institute and the Heritage Institute and the Heritage Foundation and the Fraser Institute in the 1990s, to sort of create a global league table of the world's countries and territories. And I saw recently, I read recently an excellent book by Hilary Appel and Mitchell Orenstein called From Triumph to Crisis, about the post-Soviet space in East Central Europe. And their definition of neoliberal was just like, if you rise in the rankings of economic freedom, then you must be doing neoliberal things. So the kind of things that the Economic Freedom of the World Index considers good are by definition neoliberal. I actually don't mind that as a kind of a parsimonious way of, or at least a very easily quantifiable way of dealing with this question in analysis. So that would be the second way. It's not necessarily a period of history, but it's just, it's a bundle of policy proposals. The way that I deal with it in my work is kind of as an intellectual movement, right? So it's not a label that has been applied by critics or by scholars to this thing, but it's this group of thinkers who, beginning in 1938, came together and said, how can we somehow thread the needle between socialism on the left and fascism on the right, revive liberalism as we understand it in the era of mass democracy, in the era of national self-determination? What kind of ways do the responsibility of the state as a proactive actor, so by no means something to be rolled back or sort of made to evaporate or disappear, but as a proactive actor in protecting the free market, how can we rethink the nature of the state and the nature of the law under conditions of mass democracy and national self-determination in the 20th century? They just literally got together in the 1930s and asked themselves that question, and they said, what do we call this new thing we're doing? It's not laissez-faire capitalism. It's not a belief in a night watchman state. It doesn't believe in the need to diminish the influence of the state on the sort of conduct of human affairs. In fact, it requires, as they put it, a strong state and a free market. So that conversation began in 1938. This is, retelling a story that's well known for people who have read some of these books. But these guys got together, and it was all guys, in Paris at the Walter Lippmann Colloquium, getting together to talk about a new book by the journalist Walter Lippmann, which didn't necessarily totally support their views, which I write about in my book. But anyway, that was the occasion. And then after the Second World War, they got back together in 1947 to form the Mont Pelerin Society. And since then, people like Hayek and Friedman and James Buchanan and Richard Epstein and a whole fleet of other people about who now several books have been written, have created kind of what I called, I was joking on Twitter today, but I actually kind of think it's not a bad description, the kind of Mont Pelerin extended universe of people who are in conversation with each other, debating, banging ideas around. Sometimes there's policymakers there, sometimes there's journalists there, often there's funders there. So the Mont Pelerin Society is a way of describing neoliberalism as a kind of pretty discreetly contained set of intellectual discussions, which nonetheless has a lot of intellectual diversity within it. People range from sort of Murray Rothbard types who want to do away with the state altogether on the far fringe of anarcho-capitalism, to people like more centrist or center-right ordo-liberals of the German tradition who could even imagine things like, social insurance and worker protections and minimum wage and so on. So it's kind of a, it's one way to engage with the history of neoliberalism. This is one way to do it, is to say, when we say neoliberalism, we just mean this narrowly defined group of people having a finite number of conversations, writing a finite number of books that nonetheless contain a lot of diversity, that have had concrete points of interaction with many sort of momentous, policy rollout events, from the currency reform in Germany in 1948 to the Chilean Constitution and so on. So that's the sort of the Mont Pelerin approach to neoliberalism, right? And that's the one that I guess I operate within, just through the products of my writing in the last decade or so. And that even though it seems quite narrow, I find it can be quite illuminating, because strange things are happening in the realm of the Mont Pelerin universe these days. Many of the currents that we would describe as sort of right-wing populist, especially in the last 5 or 6 years, which seem to be rejecting neoliberalism, as it's often said, are actually coming as kind of schisms or mutant versions of neoliberal politics and political philosophy from within the movement. So a case in point is, if you've been following German politics, the Alternative for Germany party, which the AfD, which is the first far-right party to enter the German parliament in the post-war period, was formed by a gaggle of German ordo-liberal economists in 2013 to protest the way that they thought that Merkel and the Troika were mismanaging the Eurozone crisis. They're like, we don't like the Euro, we want to go back to the Deutschmark. We want out of this European behemoth. It's turning into this green socialist monster. And so the way that we can restore good free market principles is by returning to the nation, strengthening a commitment to the German folk as well, in the sense that Muslim immigrants, people from Muslim majority countries, especially Turks, were seen as economically inefficient, economically unproductive, drains on the welfare state. So this right-wing populist movement, as it's often been described in the United States as a kind of like recrudescence of long dormant Nazi ideology, for example, is actually this kind of mutant version of neoliberalism in response to the quite extraordinary events of the last 12 or 13 years since the global financial crisis. So that's true in Germany. You could tell a similar story in Austria. You could tell a similar story in Switzerland. You could tell a similar story quite clearly with the Brexit campaign in the UK. And the sort of think tank neoliberals were actually extremely good at weaseling in and getting the ear of Donald Trump as well, right? I don't think they really conducted his campaign, and I think Bannon did, whose thinking is actually quite different than this in some ways. But once in office, people like Stephen Moore were extremely effective, people from the Harland Institute and so on, were extremely effective in getting close to Trump and making him do the kind of things that they've been wanting to do for the last 20 years, right? Shredding environmental regulations, massive tax cuts, and generally pursuing the kind of economic freedom agenda above really all other sort of imperatives, right? So in other words, I think you would think that looking at the Multipolarian society would be extremely limiting and strange, and why look at these just this small, periodically meeting group of mostly academics and think tank, habitués. But actually, for me anyway, it's been quite helpful. So that's a kind of a defense of my own approach, which is especially in this so-called backlash period of the last several years. I find that a lot of the mainstream reporting has been extremely bad and extremely misleading by making any rejection of the existing 1990s style globalism as being some kind of visceral cry of pain from the heartlands, being sort of channeled by the standard bearers of the populist and far right. I think that's a lousy description empirically. And I think that the kind of ideological entrepreneurs of the right, more often than not, have some kind of a conflicted relationship to what you could think of as the neoliberal thought collective. And incidentally, I'm about 1/4 of the way through this new book by Andreas Malm and the Clara Zetkin collective that's just coming out on Verso now, called what is it called? White Skin, Black Fuel, or Black Fuel, White Skin, the rise or the threat of fossil fascism. And they're extremely, this is about a 600-page book, and they're extremely methodical with this, showing how the climate denialist think tanks are sort of feeding lines to a lot of these, supposedly de novo far-right populist mobilizations across Europe and the United States. So I think that's one way of looking at neoliberalism, is sort of through political entrepreneurship, political ideology, use a lot of intellectual history approaches, right? You actually just read texts, you read the transcripts of meetings, you follow people online and see what kind of things they blurt out, and then you screen cap them or write them down for later, because they're often telling on themselves, either intentionally or otherwise. And then you endure their insane sort of crusades that you end up being the object of. So right now I'm, enduring various things associated with people who are paid, their paychecks are paid for by the American Institute for Economic Research, which was the midwife of the Great Barrington Declaration, as you all probably remember from sort of mid-pandemic, when they were casting skepticism on all kinds of lockdown and vaccine measures. They also have kind of a sideline in trying to discredit anyone who speaks ill of their heroes. So if you write something bad about Ludwig von Mises or Friedrich Hayek, then you will hear about it directly, and also the presses that publish your articles will hear about it directly, which is something that's happening right now. Gumming up the system with all kinds of fake sort of grievances. So that's one thing to do. I don't think it's the only thing to do. And I think the reason why I assigned the Dados and Connell piece is because they make I think the strongest critique of this approach. They sort of say, what is this narrative that people like me, even though they wrote this before I was really publishing stuff, what are these Multipolarian society obsessives actually doing? And they say, well, they're doing something very easy, which is they're accessing these publications that are widely available and written by people in well-funded positions like George Mason University, University of Chicago, whatever. And they're just parsing their ideas and then making leaps of interpretation from there about how they affected policy or whatever. And that's not a correct way to write the history of neoliberalism, according to them. That neoliberalism was rolled out and experimented with first and foremost in the global South. And the sharp end of neoliberal policies has always been in places far from Chicago and Virginia. So we need, if we want to engage with this category of neoliberalism, which in a way is not one that we have the complete right to define for ourselves, right? I mean, I think this is an important thing to talk about, which is that the term was not a kind of academic concoction, right? I mean, we have the 1938 thing, sure, but where did the recent usage come from? Well, it came from activists in Latin America. opposing the forms of right-wing authoritarianism that existed across the continent from the 60s until the 90s. And then again, more recently, obviously, in places like Brazil, that neoliberalism as a category is actually, it returned as an actor's category amongst its opponents. And then it came into French, it came into German in the late 1990s, and then it blew up in English kind of mostly in the early 2000s, even though, of course, there's all kinds of usage that you can find in the 90s. So in that sense, if you want to say, how do you engage with neoliberalism in the way that the average person, part of a social movement where capitalism is fucking them up the most intensely, would describe it, then appealing to the mountain of Mont Pelerin in Switzerland is probably a lot less relevant a lot of the time, right? And it probably makes a lot more sense to start talking about the kind of things that I guess Thea Riofrancos would have been speaking to you all about last time when she was here, which is like, what's happening with massive extraction projects, what's happening with the kind of terms being given to, global South governments by international financial institutions. How are bond markets constraining the ability for national sovereign states to make decisions about their own, populations and territories? The kind of the practice of neoliberalism, understood as modal global capitalism since the 1980s, then is certainly at least as important and probably more important than parsing through the pamphlets and the footnotes of the Mont Pelerin Society, right? So I think I'm in kind of a bind with the category, because on the one hand, I think that from a kind of academic point of view, it's been very clarifying to just be like, look, let's just talk about it in this narrow way. But on the other hand, I know that as a kind of a category of mobilization, or something people want to use or are already using organically to make sense of what's happening to their countries and their lives, then that might not have the most direct bearing on the way that they see their own personal struggles, right? So to give you a last example here, and then I'd like to just open it up to conversation. But there is kind of, I guess, a fourth way of describing neoliberalism, which is more like the way Wendy Brown and people like her describe it, which is not so much a bundle of policy ideas or a period of time, and certainly not just like a gang of like white dudes on top of a Swiss mountain, but more like the way that people relate to themselves and them and each other and their work, especially, and that people see themselves as a kind of a bundle of assets that they need to kind of maximize the value of, and that they hopefully can speculate on, build their own brand, stretch themselves thin, try to maneuver amongst all of the pressures and contingent realities of the workplace in 21st century America for these purposes. And that if you want to talk about neoliberalism, you should talk about that. What does it feel like to wake up in the morning and have to like not see your kids for 14 hours because you're like taking the bus to like 3 different shitty jobs where you're being, observed through newly created forms of digital technology the whole time. And again, like I don't protest that use of the term. My only rebuttal is I think that's just capitalism. Right. I think that if you read the Communist Manifesto, as I do, every semester in one context or another with my students, the kind of descriptions there of the way that the veil has been torn away from the family, everything that we once thought was sacred has been profaned and so on. It sounds to me an awful lot like the kind of Wendy Brown description of neoliberalism a lot of the time. Like, yes, we have come to treat each other like objects. Yes, we mediate our lives through money. Yes, we see each other as things. That didn't start in the 1970s. Right. And I think that's for me part of actually Lee Claire LaBerge, who I think a New York DSA member, we wrote something together, and that was why she didn't use the term for years, because she's like, it's just capitalism. Like if that's what it is, if it's just like people treating each other like commodities and having to maximize their value in the workplace, I don't know why we need a new word for it. And I kind of agree. And that's also part of my rationale for being like, let's just keep neoliberalism to this small thing. So that's the case for that. But I'm happy to just then maybe just pivot from that to like a more open like discussion. If people have any questions about the things I've written or have any, you know, strong objections to the kind of way I'm framing this, then I'd love to hear it.
Hello. Thank you very much for the talk. I'm going to move into the community agreements. Firstly, everybody's here to learn, and please assume good intentions and be calm. If you have a question, please write stack in the chat, and you'll be called on to ask your question. And when you are called on to ask, please be brief and keep your question under 30 seconds, and keep your anecdotes and context to a minimum. And Christian?
Hi, Quinn. It's good to hear you talk. I appreciate your writing a lot. So I guess so I'm a Gen Xer, and I feel like I totally agree that a lot of this is just capitalism, but I think, I don't know if it's like the Instagrammatization, but it feels like we used to go to work for things, you know, for companies and places, and now it almost feels like our every interaction is monetized or commodified in some way. Like, you know, besides maybe a couple of parks in New York, like there's nowhere you can even go and have a cup of coffee and sit with a friend without buying something. And so like, I think, like I find myself when I talk about neoliberalism, like that's kind of what I'm referring to as almost like this, or sometimes I would say like late stage capitalism, but it's almost like this, it just feels like it's wormed its way into places that either didn't exist before, like social media, or used to at least have some pretense of serving a public good. and all of that has kind of been wiped away in my lifetime. So so that's kind of how I think of the distinction.
Yeah, no, and I totally appreciate that. I mean, I would say that it's a challenge, right? So I'll give you two examples. One is Wendy Brown, who I just mentioned, whose work of course I've learned a great deal from, and who I think is especially a very like a kind and like extremely important figure in the academy. Another is Shoshana Zuboff, the author of The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And both of them, you know, tell in large scale a story similar to yours, right? Which is that things used to be this way and now they're that way. And we can describe this declension, this fall from grace, more or less, by calling it something new. So Wendy Brown says this thing is neoliberalism, and Shoshana Zuboff says this thing is surveillance capitalism. And the difficulty with those stories, right, as a historian, is you begin to question the golden age right away, right? So the idea that, you know, for Zuboff, the era of Ford and Sloan becomes kind of a wonderful time. And this, as the kind of, you know, all of the revisionist histories of like gender and race politics in the 1950s and 60s, I think now make so clear, it's just an extremely subjective and like partial vision of what American capitalism was like in that period, right? And the same goes for the university or the, you know, the corporate workplace. And the same goes for the city. I mean, I am also a Gen Xer, and, you know, like you probably read the Baffler in the 1990s. And the Baffler in the 1990s wasn't like, isn't it great how wonderful everything is, right? I mean, that Baffler in the 1990s was like, everything is shit, the city sucks, there's nowhere to go, we're all just walking advertisements and billboards, like music videos have ruined everything. So, I mean, you can always find that voice, right? I mean, people would have said that in the 1950s about, they did say that in the 1950s about the, you know, the inward facing man in the gray flannel suit. I mean, it was a time of a great discourse about ennui and conformity and alienation. And it was probably true. It was true. Why wouldn't it be true? So as a historian anyway, I'm always hesitant about like sort of once and for all declaring an era having been qualitatively, you know, simply one way that had been defiled later. That said, of course it's changing. Of course it's changing. Of course it's different that right now, you know, what we're saying is being, you know, analyzed by some big piece of data software somewhere, and where profiles are being created for our future consumption interests. I mean, that's different. There is something different there. So I think it's walking that line between kind of golden ageism on the one hand, and then kind of plus ça change, like, and nothing ever changes. We've always been in the cage or whatever, and that's But I think it is important to avoid one or the other of those poles, is all I'm saying. And I think that neoliberalism as a category too often provides an easy out by saying, like, here's a thing that explains why everything is different. And I think that often things that are being pointed to say that everything is different are not necessarily that different from what preceded them. And that maybe the challenge is often seeing what the seeds of things we call neoliberal were in the era when they were supposedly not present. And the work of someone like Amy Offner recently, I think, is very good on this. And she's trying to look at how a lot of the things around public-private partnerships, for example, the way that the state begins to turn to corporations to do things that we think that the state should do without partnering with companies, was something that she tracks back to the 1930s. You can follow it in the Great Society. It's all over the development ethos globally. So yeah, I mean, that's that's maybe like out Gen Xing you, because that's the full Gen X maybe is like, it's always sucked. Right. But I appreciate it. I get what you're saying.
Thank you, David.
Well, I think the "it's just capitalism" is 2/3 right. The first word and the last word. It is capitalism, but capitalism has been different in different periods. And those of us who lived through both of the epochs, the post-World War II period and the current era, I mean, the differences really are quite dramatic, but they were both capitalism. And I think this is an important point for socialist activism and organizing in this period, because now that I think neoliberalism is under challenge, with the rise of Bernie and his policy proposals, etc., there is a danger that a lot of people who've been attracted to socialism because they hated the capitalism that they knew will gravitate toward another round of just reforming capitalism, because it is better for working people, even though it's still capitalism and is exploitive and causes all these problems. So I think the distinction is useful for that purpose, so that we can both point out to some of the specific reasons why conditions are so bad for working people and other oppressed groups, point to some policies that may be social democratic, but at the same time pointing out that as long as it's still capitalism, it won't be a long-run solution to the problems that ordinary people face. So I think it's a useful concept. Yeah,
I mean, I get what you're saying, but I think you could argue in a different way, which is that by amending sort of neoliberal to capitalism, or talking about it as neoliberalism, it actually sets you up to accept a modified form of capitalism more, right? I mean, I'm only speaking from like the kind of close reader of like the pages of the Financial Times or whatever, where they're on the borderline of starting to say neoliberalism is dead, right? I mean, I don't know if they've said that per se, but they're very close. And when they say that, they don't mean, of course, anything about the core qualities of capitalism being under threat. They can say that, and it can seem like a pseudo overthrow of the existing order, while still retaining, much of it, nearly all of it. And so, do you know what I mean? That I think that is, there's another way to see that modification of capitalism is actually can undercut attempts to identify the core target of critique.
I think whether we use the term neoliberalism or not, those forces are gonna
Sure.
time for reform.
Yeah,
that'll solve all the problems.
yeah, no, of course. I wonder about, the more I've seen it sneak into the mainstream commentary of kind of like Bloomberg, not Wall Street Journal, but Times and so on, the more I wonder if it has if it's being celebrated in its moment of supposed overthrow in a very instrumental way, that becomes then it becomes a sort of cosmetic way to apologize for whatever is coming next. Well, at least it's not neoliberalism. But at the same time, I do find it helpful to sort of be specific about what does one mean then, when you say neoliberalism, because I myself am asking myself that all the time. What are all the kind of preconceptions that seemed commonsensical to the sort of policy consensus at the highest level that are starting to crack, or that are showing, their weakness in the last year or 2, 3, and they are there, right? I mean, I think that around trade, around fiscal policy, there's obviously a kind of wavering on what is natural and what should be sort of the horizon of politics. And I think it sometimes makes sense for me to talk about the kind of long 90s consensus as a kind of a neoliberal globalist consensus. The idea that money should be able to go anywhere, production should be able to go anywhere, will be protected wherever it goes, that American interests are global interests. A lot of those things that do strike me as like forms of a particular moment of global capitalist, political relations that are now, mostly because of China, as Isabella Weber knows better than anyone, now under serious threat. So yeah, I don't know. I'm right. I mean, of course, there's in a way also there's nothing more boring than the sort of the rebuttal that that's just capitalism, stupid, right? So I mean, that's not necessarily the most helpful rhetorical gesture either, and I can totally see that. So it's not a flight from specificity. I completely agree with you that it's necessary to say what characterized this era of global capitalism for the United States versus Europe versus other countries, and it's preventing the short circuit, I think, is my biggest desire, right? I mean, my biggest hope is that people don't use a word to substitute for analysis, that they allow the difference of these forms of capitalism, both at the same time and over time, to, they open those up to more close study. Sure you agree.
Okay, next we have Carrington.
Hi there. Thank you so much, Quinn, for coming here to speak. I know Doug speaks so highly of you, and he was part of his motivation, at least as he expressed to us, in having you, is how impressed he is by the Mount Pelerin group, like how strategic they were, and wondering about lessons they might offer to the left. I mean, as unfortunate as their strategies are, they're effective. Right. And I think at this time, especially as DSA, we'd like to understand how we can best apply pressure on the status quo to serve the many. And if you have any ideas of strategies, we can learn from them.
Yeah, right. I mean, as it turns out, this isn't a totally theoretical conversation, right? I mean, so something very close to what you're describing happened in the last 3 years. Which is that in 2018, the Hewlett Foundation started a project called Beyond Neoliberalism that they funded with a 2-year, $10 million grant, and that they justified in exactly the terms you just, described, Doug describing. And I know we've talked about that before, this idea that, hey, what did they do? They took ideas that were marginal, they funded them well, they changed the consensus, they changed common sense, and then they targeted policymakers, and they managed to perform this kind of surprising transformation of what was assumed to be the reality of politics. And the person who was spearheading this, a guy named Larry Kramer, who's a University of Chicago law professor, who was himself on the ground in Hyde Park when this happened in the 1970s, when the law and economics field came from being a marginalized group of outsiders to basically setting the consensus for what antitrust policy means and so on in the United States. He saw it happen, and he's like, if I saw it happen once, it can happen again. So quite literally, he persuaded them to put this money up. They funded a bunch of things, including the Boston Review series that I've, among other things, I think Thea edited one of them. I wrote the Shoshana Zuboff review in one of them that was otherwise devoted to economics beyond neoliberalism with, kind of Roderick and Zuckman and people like that. And then Democracy Journal, there was just a few, there's money that went out to a bunch of publications and think tanks like the Roosevelt Institute, Center for American Progress, so on. A bunch of those people are now in the Biden administration, right? I mean, Heather Boucher, Sabeel Rahman. These are people who, Jennifer Harris, who ran the Beyond Neoliberalism initiative, is on the National Economic Council and the National Security Council now. And they've just rebooted the Beyond Neoliberalism project for another 5 years at $10 million a year. They just announced it 2 months ago in March, as she left for the administration. So it's not hypothetical. This is actually something that is not only being attempted, but has actually shown some fruits. I think that there are people now, and people have talked about this in different ways, how to describe this sort of post-neoliberal cohort that is now, standing up to Larry Summers, kind of thumbing their nose at a lot of the kind of elder statesmen of austerity and sort of Wall Street proximity that had run things under the Obama administration so effectively. They're in there. So yeah, you just need the money and you need the cash. And if you have enough of it, and if you have smart people, and you have the right moment, the conjuncture of the COVID crisis, obviously in this case, you manage to get your person in power, and you get a leader who is a coalitional type, who isn't egotistically driven, who's maybe doesn't have that many ideas of his own, so he just turns to other people around him and lets himself have his ear whispered into, which is, I think, basically what Trump was too, actually. So Trump and Biden have that in common. They're sort of locomotives to which you can attach your project. So I think that's actually underway right now. Will that lead to a DSA-like future? Probably not. No, I mean, not in the short term, that's for sure. This is very much a reformist version of Beyond Neoliberalism, and it's maybe was in the back of my head when I was responding to David a minute ago, that I think in their case, to call something neoliberalism was a way of saying that's bad capitalism, we want good capitalism, right? So that was a very clear rhetorical strategy for them, as it often is, right? You say Milton Friedman, bad, shareholder value, that's not right. Stakeholder value, that's good capitalism. What does that mean? It doesn't actually mean anything. People have been saying that for decades. It's never actually cashed out as any difference in the life of average people. It's a gesture within the discursive space of the elites talking to themselves about their own morality and so on. So it is possible that this Hewlett initiative gets kind of sucked into that, the pseudo transformation, a kind of soft reformism. But I don't think it's determined in advance. Those are really smart people. You can read the things that they wrote that laid out their vision of political economy beyond neoliberalism, and they're pretty radical, right? I mean, they're out there on the radical wing of even some of the abolitionist stuff, the police defunding stuff. They're not really shrinking violets, actually. I don't know if there's any card-carrying DSA people in there. I don't think so. But anyway, yeah, that's my answer to that. Is like, it's not a theory. It's being tested out right now.
Amazing answer. Next we have OB.
Oh, me? Okay. Thank you. So I have so many questions. And I guess the first one I want to ask is, I tend to think about neoliberalism really taking its like form, and not form, but like the way the ideas are spread throughout the population, like right after the fall of the Berlin Wall. I'm wondering how much that event plays into the way that we conceive of neoliberalism right now. Mm-hmm. And the other question I have is kind of an obvious question, but how much did the 2020 and COVID really affect how neoliberalism is being perceived right now?
Yeah, I mean, those are both really good big questions. So, I mean, on the first one, The fall of the Berlin Wall, right. So the standard, historical narrative would say that the wall fell, Francis Fukuyama declared it the end of history, and then liberal democracy reigned sort of uncontested until this horrible moment of backlash around 2016, right? I mean, you don't have to vary too far from that narrative in a lot of the subtext in the Washington Post and the foreign affairs and places like that over the last several years. Obviously, that was never correct. I think the interesting thing in the case of the Berlin Wall, to look at the neoliberal intellectuals themselves, the kind of people I've been talking about, the Montpellieran people, is to see what they were scared of. So I have, tons of texts that they wrote within a year of the Berlin Wall falling, when they were like, don't be deceived. This is not the end of socialism. It only looks like the end of communism. What's going on really? State is getting ever bigger as a proportion of the GDP. State spending continues to grow. The EU, which we thought was going to be like an engine of neoliberal competition, they feared in the 1990s, was turning into a social transfer machine, and they feared that it was going to be used to kind of over-regulate the labor market and create kind of distributive equality. And then three, most importantly, they feared that socialism had just turned from red to green, and that the environmental movement was the new threat. It was replacing the communists, and it was even worse because it had roots deep in the kind of middle class in the wealthy countries. And it was also, believed in by the elites and the opinion makers and so on. So in other words, like, it depends on how you describe neoliberalism. If you describe it from this sort of Montpellieran point of view, ironically, they saw the Berlin Wall as like a great challenge because they saw it producing new enemies for true, economic freedom. The green people, the Europeans, and the statists, the bureaucrats who continue to exist on their paychecks in Washington, D.C., ... all this horrible rhetoric that we know, unfortunately, all too well. So that's one way of describing that there. And as for the rest of the world, well, it depends where you look, right? I mean, if you're interested in Eastern Europe, then yeah, the 1990s were a time of the absolute gutting of state-owned enterprises, the vanishing of job security, and the kind of basic cradle-to-grave state insurance that people could rely on. Not saying that everyone loved living under state socialism, but there were many things that they missed when they were gone, let's put it that way. And many of them were very vocal about that, and you can follow these things in opinion polls. So yeah, neoliberalism went wild if you were in a former state socialist country in Eastern Europe. But then, in other parts of the world, the 90s were a time of the beginning of pushing back against neoliberalism and leading up to the pink tide in Latin America. So I hesitate to make kind of like, this is one of the things I really try not to do, is make kind of like global claims about like, then neoliberalism conquered the world. It's just not, it's not politically productive, and it's not empirically correct, right? It's, the world is a space of combined and uneven development, always has been, always will be. And it makes a lot more sense to look and say, where were things going against against the tide? Where were things, happening that were different than other places? Where were things happening at different paces? So in that sense, the Berlin Wall fell and neoliberalism won. I think that that's an unhelpful narrative, actually. I think we need to try to think about that one differently, or else we get an overly monolithic vision of how global history works. On your second point was about how much did 2020 actually change? And so I think some things changed and some things didn't. I think that clearly on questions of trade, already existing trends were accelerated, right? So the challenge of China to America has been on the radar of the American executive and lawmakers since the Obama era, but really, kicked in under Trump. Go back and read the way that the trade war with China was being described in 2017. people assumed that the sky was going to fall. They would be absolutely punished by voters in the midterms. I mean, Joseph Stiglitz, himself no fan of neoliberalism, wrote something about this in like the January of 2017, the rise of Trump and the end of neoliberal globalism or something. And he was just like, he's making a colossal policy error. This is going to just like destroy the supply chains. And all of a sudden, none of it came true. None of it came true. Voters didn't care. It barely affected prices. They staged the biggest trade war since the 1930s. And most Americans hardly even realized it was happening. Does that mean it was inconsequential? No. I mean, it totally changed the game between China and the United States. And it then changed the game for Canada, Mexico, and the EU, because they all ended up coming online against China. And the new order now, global economic order, is about first and foremost containing China. That's what globalism is about now, actually. That's why you cooperate on issues of trade. And that is not like the 90s, right? I mean, in the 90s, the US was seeing itself as being only profiting by the opening up markets. So had no problem with doing that, trading off some sectors for others, obviously, giving up on certain things, textiles and agriculture, whatever, to some extent, to exchange for things like pharmaceuticals and software and so on. There's all these trades happening. But so I think that, 2020, first of all, what did it do? Okay, this virus came from China that then created a global meltdown. So the idea of China as the new opponent entrenched some geoeconomic trends that were already happening. So that happened, for sure that happened. Biden came in, changed nothing, right? Catherine Tai took over as a US trade representative from Robert Lighthizer, basically changed nothing. Maybe took some of the labor stuff a little more seriously, but otherwise, almost you couldn't tell the difference. That's crazy from a point of view of trade governance. The bigger difference, though, I think, is around the attitude towards fiscal policy, right? The willingness to sign off on these enormous packages and infrastructure in the first months of the presidency are totally, out of sync with what Obama did and what he would have ever done, right? So the kind of inflation genie had been killed in the intervening years from 2008 to now, at least in the minds of policymakers, enough that they could say, screw it, let's go for it. Let's go big. Let's go over that trillion mark that until then was like a taboo. You would never go over a trillion. Now it's like, if you're not doing a trillion, you're not serious. So that's like a totally strange twisting of the reigning rationality or the assumptions that people had about what you could do at the state spending level, right? So that's, and what will the effects be? We don't know yet. We're still waiting to find out. The Europeans, with some hesitation, took the cue as well, same way they took some hesitation after the global financial crisis. So America is setting the pace on the destruction of this sort of, at least rhetorical universalism of trade governance until recently, and they're leading the pace on this sort of breathtaking fiscal expansionary policy. Why would that not lead me to say, therefore, hurrah, the witch is dead, neoliberalism is gone? Because I don't think the lives of average working people have changed that much in the intervening years. And in fact, I think they've mostly gotten worse. I think that the wealth that was produced through these projects of quantitative easing since 2008 have been mostly accruing to the top of the socioeconomic pyramid. They have not been gained by people at the bottom. The wealth of the last 12 months has done the same, in that sense. It's kind of like a caricature of the last decade. If you think that neoliberalism was dying in 2020, we'll have a look at see who actually got the new wealth in 2020. It was a tiny fraction of the population, and most people got none of it or lost their jobs and entered eras of deep precarity. So I think that even if the top level consensus has changed on trade, climate, and fiscal policy, that has not trickled down to average people's lives yet. I don't think anyone is walking around challenging neoliberalism sent from Washington at the average workplace. And I think there, the question of whether or not the Biden administration will be genuine in its support for organized labor is a huge question. I think they're giving signals in that direction, but I think there's just as much of a lobby, even amongst these reformist so-called post-neoliberals, who would see a much more working relationship as you keep a hire and fire flexible labor market, supplement it with something like in the future, like a universal basic income, more kind of welfare transfers, but you don't gum up the whole works by giving rights to working people as organized union leaders or members, because that is really the great sort of source of sclerosis and kind of inflexibility that I think even the more progressive people in the Democratic Party are still worried about. How do you bring back supply chains and produce things economically in the United States, from lithium to electric vehicles, if people are going to be actually organizing and asking for wages high enough to make these things prohibitively expensive or whatever, right? That's I think the real mental image, I bet, that a lot of the kind of reformist policymakers have, is where will the game of chicken with organized labor actually stop? And I think it's the most important thing to watch in a way. I think that there's going to be a lot of lip service about just energy transitions and lots of money going to infrastructure and new green technologies. You can almost be sure of that. The taps of the Fed are going to be wide open for some time now, based on all the signals. But will organized labor be allowed to come back too? That's what I'm very interested to find out.
Ryan?
Thank you, Quinn. And thank you for writing so eloquently about the role of the Mont Pelerin Society in not only, to take off from Carrington's question, in not only acting strategically, but to wall off large segments of economic policymaking from democratic influence. And my question to you is, what role can the idea of modern monetary theory play in breaking down those barriers in terms of democratic influence of economic policy?
Yeah, well, we're lucky this is virtual, because it means Doug can't jump over there and start strangling you, I guess, based on his reputation vis-a-vis MMT. I'm going to be honest and say that it's not something that I've thought about that much. I should have, but I think that, it depends on how you define that, right? Like, in effect, again, like turning to my trusty pages of the financial press, what you read all the time, that like, in effect, everyone is a modern monetary theorist at this point, in the sense that the belief that you need to sort of balance out spending with cuts, and that there is some kind of inevitable inflation that will come as a result of, large scale liquidity creation. I mean, that core idea is kind of become the consensus, the acting consensus anyway, right? I mean, in the Treasury and the Fed, in the sense that Janet Yellen kind of laughs people off if they say that there's going to be inflation still. I mean, she's wavering. This is all like to be determined in the coming months, obviously, with the new CPI reports and so on. But I think that this question is behind that question is a more general one that you're asking about the way that certain policy areas get sort of insulated off and hived away from democratic influence. And here is, I think it's kind of important. I don't know if you've read the Globalist book, but I think it's possible to kind of misread that book, and maybe it's partially my fault, which is to say that I think it's possible to read the desires of neoliberals as actual achievements or things that actually have become fact. So the idea, for example, that they use and I use to describe what they're interested in, of like locking in certain things, and the way that, let's say, trade policy gets like, removed from the space of democratic deliberation, and, taken to a second level of multi-level governance at something like the WTO, or through investor ISDS, sort of investor dispute settlement procedures and so on. It's quite easy to exaggerate that. I mean, I'll say that as a kind of a self-critique, but it's easy to sort of get the impression that that has actually happened more than it actually has. It is still possible to, as we now know through the example of the USMCA and the basically stalled out WTO, it wasn't actually hived off from democratic control for all time. No, NATO was torn up by the Trump administration and renegotiated in very similar form to what it was before, but it happened. They pulled out and they renegotiated. WTO is right now out of commission because American executives didn't want the WTO to exist. Do you know what I mean? So my point being that I think it's good as kind of critics of neoliberalism not to buy their dreams too much as if they've been converted into reality, and to realize that a lot of these things, especially when it gets above the nation state, acts the same way international law always acts, which is that it exists insofar as the member states agree to follow the laws that they themselves have agreed to. And it is possible most of the time to kind of, withdraw yourself from them or act differently. But this is where we get into the why it's important to study neoliberalism in practice and not just on the page, right? So I'll give the example of a wonderful book. I'll just put it in the chat here, by Jerome Rose, called Why Default? Or sorry, Why Not Default? And he studies, 30 years of global South countries being put into, untenable positions by their international creditors. And he's asked this question over and over: why don't they just default? I mean, you actually can default. Why wouldn't you? And the answer is, well, you wouldn't want to harm your reputation in the lending market for the next time you actually need to go and get money again. So people self-police, in other words, right? Or nations self-police, and they act in ways that make them seem like good clients in future. So why is that important as an answer to your question? Is that I think it's also important not to exaggerate the effectiveness of law. Actually, the law seeks to do certain things, but often law is effective because of the effect it has of countries, governments, individuals self-regulating and self-policing, and then taking on that, that discipline for themselves. So I think that if anything should be taken from the last insane 5 years of American history we've just lived through. David mentioned Bernie at the top, and I think it's worth mentioning again, right? I mean, when Bernie ran in 2016 as a Democratic candidate, he just said things you weren't supposed to say. He broke a bunch of taboos, especially around questions of trade governance. And it turns out when you say these things, then they actually, they become available to others. And then once he was out, Bannon, being a smart strategist, just said, wow, they just left us all of these trade issues. They left us deindustrialization. They left us competition with China. They left us the suffering working class in the Midwest, because Hillary isn't doing that very persuasively. So let's just pick up those issues. So in other words, a lot of these things that were supposed to be beyond politics or beyond democratic control, right? Like, how can you bring manufacturing jobs back to the Midwest? Globalization is just a storm. It's like weather. It's like a changing of the seasons. Investors will always just go where conditions are best. There's nothing we can do about it. It turned out that was always bullshit, right? And it took someone like Bernie to come out and just say, like, that is bullshit. And then now he repoliticized something that had been depoliticized. So in other words, these things aren't permanent, right? And so I think monetary policy, like all other forms of policy, can be made political again. It doesn't mean, you know, Doug just pointed out, but they haven't exactly brought back manufacturing to the Midwest, exactly. But it is, as the Germans call it now, a politicum. It is an object of politics, right? You were able to talk about it and say, can this happen? If so, who would pay for it? Who would gain and lose? As opposed to reneging agency and just saying, we can't, it's natural, it's globalization, which is what Blair, Clinton, and Schroeder did in the late 1990s and early 2000s. They said, we can't do anything about it. It's just how it is. We need to, you know, shrink the welfare state. We need to let go of all of these branches of economic activity. And I think, you know, as we discovered, that's not a sustainable way to have a conversation about political economy with the population, right? You leave yourself open to a vulnerable flank, which can be attacked as soon as someone has the guts to do it, or the cynicism, whichever you prefer. I feel like it's getting quite dark in here. Can you still see me? Oh, it's okay. My computer screen is lighting me up.
Yeah, no, we can still see you.
Okay, good.
Next we have Chris.
Hi, greetings from the West Coast. I'm out in Portland, Oregon. I'm here courtesy of Carrington having hold a subcommittee of the International Committee about this. And I'm so glad I'm here. It's really interesting. I am a late boomer. I graduated from college into the Volcker recession. And for me, a lot of the timeline ought to be shifted a bit earlier. And I'm not sure how much, you know, the perceptions of Gen Xers and millennials as a generational thing actually affects this. But I first encountered the word neoliberalism as such. I'm a historian of Africa, and Review of African Political Economy and places like that, and also African expatriate scholars who were connected back home to the imposition of structural adjustment regimes in the 80s. You know, we're using it in the mid 80s, and there was a turn on a dime policy shift in 1985, where up until that point, international quote unquote development policy had included support for the state as an actor, and radical shift very quickly away from that, combined with, you know, aggressive use of debt pressure to force governments to fall into line. And for me, the word austerity is the one that captures the heart of what I've met by neoliberalism, but also in a certain sense, like moral apotheosis of austerity as a good moral thing, right? You know, the whole underclass business in the United States. There's a whole lots of places. And so I guess my question would be, is there a way to connect the kind of intellectual history that you're doing, the policy pieces, using the idea of the hegemony of ideological hegemony of neoliberal ideology? You know, so you know, you raised Stiglitz as a critic of neoliberalism, but you know, you had Stiglitz and Krugman and this guy in Columbia, the
Sachs,
right? You know, who were like the architects of if the policy implementation starts in Latin America, migrates to Africa and the Caribbean, and then, you know, its big moment is the collapse of the state socialist system and shock doctrine stuff. Those guys were in there imposing the shock treatment in
sure.
So
Yeah.
and then, you know, so and then I feel like in, you know, what the quote unquote Great Recession did in a certain sense was break the hegemony. You know, whereas in the 70s, I grew up surrounded by media who were, you know, just you couldn't defend fair deal, great society liberalism anymore in the United States. With the Great Recession, you got, you know, the inescapability of inequality. And in a certain sense, to me, that represents a kind of breaking of the hegemony. But then that's not to say that the ideas don't have any power anymore, or forces behind them, or forces using them. But so anyway, I'm just sort of wondering if there's a way to connect the narratives between the sort of piece and the policy piece.
Sure. Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying for sure. I mean, I can give you one example, which is on the kind of the rollout of, you know, what we now call the Washington Consensus. I mean, internally at the time in the 1980s, it was actually called the new political economy inside the halls of the World Bank, the research division, right? So the research division was taken over by Ann Kruger, which pushed towards the kind of policies you're describing. And something I've written recently, I spent a couple pages writing about the work of people like Deepak Lal, who was working under her and trying to kind of theorize their way towards this new paradigm, which we now think of as neoliberal development policy. And what's really interesting about it is that the reason they called it new political economy is they actually felt like that the political had been left out of development theory until then. They thought that neoclassical economics, as informing the foreign aid projects of the 50s and 60s, 70s, had trusted the market too much, that you actually just needed foreign investment. And if you could get that in, then it would find opportunities. And so you could, you know, give long-term low interest loans through the World Bank or whatever. But then they thought, and I realize this is strange to hear, they thought that the previous development theorists had thought that the magic of the market would do the work. What they said was, we need to actually look at the post-colonial state, because that's the problem. The post-colonial state is kleptomaniac. It's designed to, you know, it's designed for corruption, and all that's happening is clientele networks are just taking every piece of aid and just giving them to family members and cronies or whatever. So if we want effective development aid, we actually need to tie the hands of the post-colonial state. Not that we want to get rid of the state per se, but we want them to become much more restrained in their ability to maneuver. So we actually still need them as enforcers of property rights, capital security, foreign, you know, the safety of foreigners, and those things are all essential still, and those are going to take a lot of work. But we need a different kind of state. And so they brought public choice style analysis to the post-colonial state, and they decided, you know, they determined that there's no way, in the same way that James Buchanan talks about politics or economics without romance, this is sort of like development theory without romance. Like, we don't believe that these guys are heroes of the independence movement. We don't believe any of their African socialism or whatever. We think they just are they're out for the hustle. And so we need to figure out how to create constraints so that they can't hustle anymore. And that was the goal of, you know, development policy through the World Bank, is how do you put in enough safeguards that there can be minimal maneuverability for actual democratic, sometimes, most often not, post-colonial leaders in poorer nations. So how can they be disciplined by the market? Yes, but also disciplined by the conditions under which they get the aid, hence conditionality, right? So that becomes like one half of it. Of course, the other half, as you know, you're a historian of Africa, the sort of NGOization of social services within the space of sub-Saharan Africa, especially the substitution of foreign providers for state providers. And then the interesting twist then is that very quickly the World Bank decides that this is actually inadequate and they need a more rigorous sort of epistemology to figure out how the post-colonial state should be acting. Enter transparency, enter rule of law as dominant discourses. In the 1990s, the World Bank takes what's called its legal turn. And then they start doing things like, right, ranking countries according to rule of law, quote unquote, which just means investor security. All that means, and I lay out a bit in this article I just published why that is definitely true, because the rule of law indexes that they introduced in the 90s were actually using data that was from the financial press from the 1970s. So if you were going to lend money to, Botswana or Malaysia, you didn't know anything about Botswana or Malaysia, but all you wanted to know is, am I going to get my money back? And so Euromoney, an institutional investor, made these rankings saying, like, you can get your money back from the countries in this order. And 20 years later, when they made rule of law indexes, they just went back and they said, whatever that meant, having a low interest rate, that's rule of law. That's the definition of rule of law. So I say this because I think a caricature of neoliberal development policy is that it's about rolling back the state and letting the market rip. Not at all. It's a very, very Baroque refashioning of the state and the role of law in this vision of capitalist, economic development. And I find it at least more interesting to study it that way, as a kind of a proactive political economy project, which it was. And I think that the kind of people you're describing, watching it happen probably from the University of Dar es Salaam and places like that, where Samir Amin and people like that were well aware of the kind of thing I'm talking about. It's kind of like, it's one of those things that I'm sure if you study this stuff, you've come across it before. You read an analysis from the 1970s or something, and then you realize it was all there. I mean, they just knew exactly what was happening. It's only been mystified in the meantime. You can read something from the 70s and people could say, Kruger just came in at the World Bank and she's got these new people coming in who are redefining development. And then you read an analysis of neoliberal development theory from the 1990s and they say it was just about, the autonomy of the market or something. But no, we know that it was more than that. So part of it is just, these sort of granular histories, I think, that need to be recounted and retold. And thankfully, there's a lot of really interesting people that are doing them. I'm just going to plug in my light, though, because now I'm like effectively in the dark, which feels a little strange.
Okay. Next, we're going to have Aaron, and I think we may have room for one more question. We're going to go until 8:25. So let's keep questions 30 seconds, ask them quickly. Okay. Actually, I'm looking at the clock now, so let's just do one more question. 30 seconds, let's keep it brief and wrap up the Q&A. So Aaron?
Thank you. I'll try to make it a good one. Thank you for speaking, Quinn. It's been really interesting. Piggybacking a little bit off what Chris said, a lot of what you've been saying, especially about like the kind of pressure testing of neoliberalism in the global South, did remind me a lot of like what I read about in the Shock Doctrine, which is probably my favorite book on neoliberalism. Maybe until I read yours. I still haven't a copy yet. Yeah, I think I just wanted to say that I really identify neoliberalism with privatization, like across the board privatization, like first like contractors in Iraq, and like, I'm going through like Shock Doctrine examples, but like Hurricane Katrina, and it just seems like even today in like the Biden administration, so many of like the public health systems that we've put in place are like some kind of partnership with a private enterprise or like an insurance group. I guess if there's a question in all this, it's just like, how do you see the trend of privatization coming along, in this age of maybe, quote unquote, good capitalism, like you said, like, will they be able to hang on to that part of
Yeah, no, I'm really glad you mentioned, it's funnily enough, I was going to bring up the Shock Doctrine in response to the last question, because I did actually just reread it myself after having not read it basically since it came out. And I had two seemingly totally contradictory reactions to it. My first reaction was that it's an absolutely incredible piece of writing and reporting. I mean, I had forgotten that, for example, like she gets hit by a car in New Orleans, like while she's reporting, and ends up at like the rich hospital, and then can talk about the difference between the rich hospital and the poor hospital. I'm like, who does it? She's a superhuman, like, political analyst and reporter at the same time. So I think that the through line she draws in that book, it leads from, of course, the Ewan Cameron psychological ward in Montreal, all the way up, and I think this is significant, to the invasion of Iraq and the occupation of Iraq, right? I mean, one thing I hadn't totally taken on board the first time I read that, because it was so close still to the invasion and occupation of Iraq in its early years, was how much that book is about the Iraq war in a way, right? I mean, especially the shock part, right? Of course, it's like, yes, it's the Pinochet shock, but it's really shock and awe, right? I mean, it's really about the way that the United States combined overwhelming military force with this vision of privately ordered free markets in the invasion occupation of Iraq that really just brings the hammer down with her analysis, right? So in that sense, that was my first reaction. It was just like, I'm stunned. It's such a beautiful, incredible piece of work. On the other hand, I know enough now as someone who spends all my time studying neoliberalism, that in the details, she gets almost every case wrong, at least a little bit, and sometimes quite a bit. So a case in point is like Russia, right? I mean, the story that she does want to tell there is one that came up already, which is like these young boy wonders from Columbia and Harvard came in and just like delivered a beating and just like expropriated the country, put it in the hands of the oligarchs because of their misguided belief in like, the need for overnight privatization. I've now read a lot about where neoliberalism came from in the post-Soviet Russia, and that's not really accurate much at all, actually. There was a huge cohort of sort of reformists within, well, not a huge, a large enough cohort that were then able to put themselves into positions of influence in the moments she's describing so that they could be the kind of the essential operatives for a lot of this stuff. So to analogize, the transformations in post-Soviet Russia to those of Iraq under American invasion is a misleading comparison, actually. It's not the same. And the same goes for Chile, right? I mean, most of the work now that especially Latin American historians do is not actually to continue piling blame on Milton Friedman and Arnold Harberger, but to talk about the many forms of domestic authoritarian thinking, from Francoism to forms of like Opus Dei style, Catholic authoritarianism, that were the necessary conditions for Pinochet's political economic model. So it wasn't just, airlifted from Chicago and dropped in Santiago, and that there is a bit of a perverse kind of American vanity to that kind of a description, because it implies that America is sort of the only actor in the world, right? And that if anything happened, yes, we're vilifying them in this case, but it was them somehow. You know what I mean? So especially Latin American historians, obviously very sensitive about these versions of their own histories. And this would be true also in Poland, which she focuses on, and also in some of the other examples. So that was my takeaway from that, was like, amazing book, but not everything is the Iraq invasion, actually. And actually, thank God, most things aren't, right? And that to actually understand the way neoliberalism was rolled out, you often need to understand the domestic context within which it was adopted, as much as you need to understand the sort of brutality with which an American actor of some kind was able to kind of bring it home, right? So, and this is also associated with the way that people study empire. I mean, it's not enough to understand the history of 1,000 years of empire strictly as just sheer brutality and people coming in and just stomping on people's faces for hundreds of years. It never would have worked, right? Empires won intermediaries, they won local elites, they tapped into local forms of authority and local forms of governance. They figured out ways that legitimacy works domestically and things like that. And I guess for me, that's the kind of approach to neoliberalism I find interesting now. If people are talking about diffusion and adoption in different diverse contexts, is like being really interested in specificity. Like, what was it about that context that made this sort of fertile ground at some level for these kind of policies? Well, of course, always being mindful of the asymmetries of power. And one thing I see you wanting to wind up, but one thing I will just say as a kind of a warning for people who are following the news these days is when you're reading, Katerina Georgieva, the new head of the IMF, and people, the new leadership which will come in at the World Bank, be skeptical, because the people who have done the work on this have found that the World Bank and the IMF have declared themselves reformed many times over in the last few decades, and in actual practice changes very little. So the sort of PR department of the kind of elite establishment is often willing to say one thing, but then the actual business end of things, whether it's the lenders or the employers or the investors, are often more likely to do something totally different. So I think an attitude of constant skepticism and vigilance is always the best approach. You should be most concerned when people start saying neoliberalism is dead, in other words.
Okay, thank you so much, Quinn. It's been amazing hearing your answers to all these great questions. Thank you, everybody, for the questions. We're going to pass it on for announcements and then wrap up.
Cool.
All right, thank you everyone for the truly insightful questions tonight. And thank you to Ashley for facilitating the Q&A portion tonight. And thank you, Quinn, for coming tonight. I'm always impressed by what people ask in night school sessions. People always have the most interesting questions that people presenting to the presenter. Anyway, in terms of announcements, we have some asks for everyone who has come tonight in terms of action, some future North Brooklyn political education events, and just some general reminders about DSA. The first ask we have is to please come out to events for Michael Hollingsworth, who, if you do not already know, needs our support as we endorse his candidacy for city council. North Brooklyn phone bank for Michael Hollingsworth on Tuesdays and canvases on Saturdays. The second ask we have is to support an ongoing strike. This strike involves local UPS workers and Teamster Local 804 members. UPS wrongfully fired 10 low-wage part-time workers in Queens, including 2 pregnant women. Already without income, UPS has now terminated the health insurance of these workers and mothers-to-be. There has been a solidarity fund started by concerned UPS workers and Teamster Local 804 members to pay healthcare expenses and to support our fellow workers while we organize to get them rehired by UPS. In the chat, there should be a link to the GoFundMe. Please check it out. Now, in terms of future events for North Brooklyn political education, we have 2 events on our horizon. The first event is an event on Palestine in collaboration with the Lower Manhattan and Central Brooklyn political education, the political education for those branches, and the NYC Anti-War Working Group, titled The Politics of Dispossession, Israel, the Palestinians, and the Current Crisis. The event will feature Muin Rubani, a distinguished independent analyst and researcher who has published and spoken widely on Middle East politics. This event will be on May 21st at 6 p.m. Please, it is incredibly important for all of us to educate ourselves about the reality of the situation in Palestine, given current events and historically. The second event in our future is we will be having a second picnic on the Jakarta Method by Vincent Bevins on Saturday, May 29th. The picnic will go over the rest of the book, in other words, chapters 7 through 12. And there's a link to both the Palestinian political education event in the chat and also the Jakarta Method picnic. Now, if you wish to get further involved with our committee, we always welcome new people. Be sure to email us at nbk.poly.ed@socialist.nyc. And also, if you're not already part of DSA, then please, we implore you to join DSA. And if you're a member of DSA, then be sure to sign up for local chapter dues.
That's it. Thanks everybody so much for coming out. It was a great session, and thank you again, Quinn, for joining us, and hope to have another event sometime again where you can join us. So thanks everybody.
Thank
and
you.
have a great night.
Good night.
Bye.